He's someone that has studied the history of civil wars, and he identifies various factors that predict a civil war generally, and he says that many of these factors have been met in the UK.
The next question is from Michelle Quinlan. Professor David J. Betts, Professor of War in the Modern World at King's College London, predicts that the UK will experience civil war within the next few years, either started at home or through contagion from nearby countries, most likely Ireland or France, and that the political off-ramp to prevent this has been passed. Do you agree?
It is an interesting thesis. Professor David Betts is an academic in the field of war studies at King's College, I think. And he's someone that has studied the history of civil wars, and he identifies various factors that predict a civil war generally. And he says that many of these factors have been met in the UK. It's a compelling thesis. I mean, I don't really feel qualified to answer the question, but I do think that there are perhaps some differences with the past. So the last civil war that we had in Britain took place before you have an organised army. You have local magnates. It's often happening in a very local way, depending on what the local lord or power broker in the area felt about the king or parliament. Whereas we now have an organised army, so I wonder how that would change things. We also have a higher level of wealth and comfort than we did in past conflicts. And we have a state with vast powers of surveillance and, as of now, a monopoly on that kind of violence. It's not like America where an awful lot of people are bearing arms. So I wonder if that could affect things. What I could see happening, I mean, I suppose Professor Betts probably isn't arguing that we would have a civil war that would take the form of the last civil war, but I could certainly imagine particular enclaves in which they become self-governing by a particular group of people. Whether you'd call that a civil war, I don't know if that would take a full-scale civil war. One thing that gives me great concern about the last couple of years is that I think it has made explicit something that we were worried about before, which is that the state is not policing evenly and without fear or favour.
Yes.
We are already conducting policing in certain areas of the country, as we saw with the West Midlands police debacle, based on the perceived fear of a particular group of people and how much power they hold. So if necessary, they will cook the books to avoid offending the belligerent offended group. That is not equal justice, and this is now too explicit to pretend it's not happening. That is really terrible because it causes a breakdown in trust between individuals and the institutions that are meant to dispense justice. And once you get that kind of anarchic feeling, I think it does pave the way for people thinking, well, it's not fair, therefore I will take matters into my own hands.
I think that sense is definitely there and growing. And David Betts, in his analysis, and it's a fascinating analysis, makes the point that what one may see are people who feel excluded, patronised, condescended to, indulging in acts of either sabotage or resistance to what they consider to be an illegitimate authority which is unsympathetic to their inherited and traditional ways of life, imposing arbitrary authority on them. So he's talking about the trend that you correctly identify and taking it to a level far more boiling hot than that which prevails at the moment. I would like to think that we'll never see civil war in Britain. I'd like to think that Britain as a country still has a gentleness, a tolerance, and aversion to extremes that would mean that it's just uncharacteristic. But I do wonder if I may be too complacent sometimes. And the other thing is that whether or not there will be, the fact that he's using this as a concept to force us to look at some uncomfortable truths about our society, I think is worthwhile. So you don't necessarily need to go along with his conclusions to find aspects of his analysis properly challenging.
Yes. I also think it's important for politics and journalism, in which memories are often very short, in which people's interest in history often begins in the 20th century and is mostly concerned with explaining today. I think we often fail to see broader historical trends in what we're living through. So, for example, because politics has felt chaotic and social media makes it feel more so, I think it is really significant that the murders of two parliamentarians, Joe Cox and David Amess, one from kind of far-right extremism and the other from Islamic terror, happened within such quick succession. It was reminiscent of the days when the last time we saw that kind of thing happening was during the IRA period in politics, which I think you can argue was a continuation of the Irish Civil War in the 20s. We are living through a time where things are escalating, and there's almost a feeling I notice amongst some commentators on the left that if one talks about these things, they imply that you yourself are trying to stir the pot, when in fact it's the not talking about things that leads to the upsurge of anger and resentment. I mean, look what has happened with the efforts to prevent discussion of the rape gangs in across the UK. I mean, one interview I saw David Betts doing, he mentions this young man who was caught on camera, and he was saying, I think he was at an EDL march, but he was talking about, quote, Muslimic ray guns. Well, that he was saying Muslimic rape gangs. He became a kind of object of derision, maybe has some very unpalatable views, but what he was saying about the rape gangs was entirely true, and a lot of the people in power chose to adopt a similar attitude towards it. And there's all kinds of TV programmes that you look back on from about 10 years ago where people attempt to raise this problem, this terrible stain on our country, and they are again met with like, oh, that's racist, that's a dog whistle.
The suppression of the uncomfortable doesn't remove it. It only leads to it developing, growing, becoming an even more profound challenge. I think that's absolutely right. I think the other thing is that in thought experiments like this, generally, as soon as you identify the trends that may point to a particular outcome, by identifying them, you do create the opportunity to deal with them. So in a way, the very fact that Professor Betts is saying that we may have passed the political off-ramp to prevent it should prompt us all to think, well, what are the steps that one might take in order to prevent this outcome coming about? I should just say in passing that last year, almost exactly last year, I read a novel called Fugue for a Darkening Island, written by Christopher Priest, who's a British novelist. Christopher Priest, is best known for The Prestige, which turned into a Christopher Nolan movie.
Oh, yes.
But Fugue for a Darkening Island, written in 1972, predicts civil war in Britain as a result of ethnic, cultural and migration tensions. And it also has a character in it who becomes Prime Minister who's an ex-Conservative leading the Reform Party. So it is uncanny and chilling. It's a book very much of its time. Some of the language, remember this was 1972, you wouldn't necessarily expect novelists to use now. But he was writing at a time when, of course, as we've just touched on, you had conflict in Northern Ireland. And in 1964 in Northern Ireland, whatever else was going on, you had a bucolic atmosphere. Then, less than 10 years later, you had the Troubles, and that preyed on his mind. So all I would say is that for those inclined to dismiss David Betts and his scholarship, I think it's far better to engage now properly with the warning signs that he has erected, rather than to dismiss him as a lurid speculator, because we've seen in our past a descent from apparent peace to civil strife in our own islands, in our own time, that should act as a warning.
If you'd like to submit your questions for Quite Right next week, you can do so at spectator.co.uk/Quite Right.